Hello everyone, welcome to the third year in the clown decade. And there's no messing about this year, we're starting straight away with some absolute peak mental gymnastics from GB News' most left-wing figure, Tom Harwood. So for context, we're going to need to go through a Times article. Trans pupils are turned down by girls' schools as threat to status. Girls' Day School Trust updated and shared its gender identity policy with member schools before the Christmas break, and it was very much on the side of biological reality. A leading group of girls' schools is to close its doors on boys who identify as girls to protect their status as single-sex institutions. Well, there you go, it's single-sex, not single-gender. Girls' Day School Trust, GDST, which represents 25 schools across England, has updated its gender identity policy. Previously, most girls' schools had been unclear in their admissions policies about whether they would accept transgender pupils. While many have pupils at the school who have changed their gender identity, asking to be treated as male or non-binary, they have avoided explicitly stating whether they would admit biological boys who identify as girls. Which is the obvious sensible position. These are single-sex schools, they are schools for girls, not trans girls, not non-binary people, whatever they are, and certainly not boys. And given the language and definitions of these things seem to change on the daily for the postmodern neo-Marxists, it's sensible just to go with the perfectly biologically accepted term of a girl meaning a adolescent female. The article continues. GDST, which includes Wimbledon High School and a load of other schools, says that its new policy, GDST, is committed to single-sex education for girls. Admissions to GDST schools are based on the prospective student's legal sex as recorded on their birth certificate. Thank you, this is probably how we should be identifying children, since they are clearly not at an age they can start defining their own gender. Because they don't really understand gender, you're still exploring gender by the time you're 18. It says of applicants who are legally female but who identify as trans or non-binary, applications will be carefully considered on a case-by-case basis. Single-sex schools present a particular context for transgender students. There may be cultural challenges involved in a trans student who does not identify as a girl attending a school which deliberately tailors its ethos and educational approach to cater specifically for girls. And again, this policy makes sense. They are schools designed and they run on an ethos of educating girls. They are perfectly within their rights as an institution to ban whatever gender identities they want from their admissions. Because if you're going to force them to let in trans girls, why in the world would you ban them from letting in any boy? It's completely up to the institution itself. The Trust says of children who are legally male but identify as trans or non-binary, GDST schools are able to operate a single-sex admissions policy without breaching the Equality Act 2010 on the basis of an exception relating to biological sex. GDST believes that an admissions policy based on gender identity rather than the legal sex recorded on a student's birth certificate would jeopardise the status of GDST schools as single-sex schools under the Act, which obviously they would. So your sex is on your birth certificate. If you start breaking what is on your birth certificate, then anyone should be allowed to go in your school. For this reason, GDST schools do not accept applications from students who are legally male. We will, however, continue to monitor the legal interpretation of this exemption. Which is another reason to just get rid of the Equality Act 2010. It's such a mishmash of legislation and law that you can basically justify anything with it. Hence you have the BBC putting out jobs that are only available to non-white people. But the rest of the Times article is just comments from people that this video isn't about, because we want to go straight into what Tom Harwood said. And in reaction to this article, Tom Harwood had this to say on Twitter. A blanket ban is insane. Young trans girls are indistinguishable from their non-trans friends. Come on, Tom. Are they? Feels like this country is uniquely in the world sliding backwards on trans rights. I wonder if he'll say that when it comes to the girls' changing rooms. So obviously this being Tom Harwood, that wasn't the end of it. He also tried to show polls that show that the UK is very split on this issue as some sort of conclusive evidence that clearly his side is winning, despite the fact public opinion doesn't necessarily mean that is, one, true, or two, the best course of action for society. And of course, because Tom Harwood works at GB News, he also had entire segments on the channel to talk about this, the more interesting one being his discussion with Calvin Robertson about the issue of what to do with transgender kids. Let's have a listen. And first he's asked about the tweet that I just showed you before, where he says, if you say transgender girls are boys, you are being horrifically rude. And this was his response to that.
I think the horrifically rude is applying to something very specific in that tweet. And that's when someone talks to someone who identifies as female, who is, for example, a transgender woman, and who calls that person a man. I think that's a very rude thing to do.
Yes, well, unfortunately, the truth can be a very rude thing, Tom. And putting people's fantasies above the truth just to spare them from harm is obviously a stupid thing. It actually probably causes more problems than it actually solves, especially when we do it on such a widespread level as the entirety of society.
It's like calling someone a name they don't want to be called.
Yeah, well, a lot of people don't like hearing things that are wrong with them. And obviously trans people that actually put effort into try and pass as the opposite sex, I'm fine with calling them the gender they're obviously trying to present as, but I'm not going to call them, say if it's a trans woman, I'm not going to call them a woman, I will call them a trans woman. And if that offends them, so be it, Tom. I have very little respect for people who put personal feelings over truth.
No, but this tweet that you specifically throw up there was in regard to the responses to that story, where people were saying boys shouldn't go to girls' schools.
Why, yes, I do think that adolescent male children should not go to girls' schools, especially when they are explicitly sex-selected, not gender-selected, Tom.
Well, transgender women aren't boys, and I think it is rude to call transgender women boys.
Hang on, why are you changing the language to transgender women? We're talking about girls' schools, Tom, not women's schools. And it'd be more accurate to call transgender women men anyway. YouTube's going to slap me so hard for hate speech here. So I'm going to skip over Calvin Robinson's bits because he's basically just making the same arguments I've already made. And we'll just get to Tom, what is a woman anyway, Harwood's arguments instead, because they're really funny.
So I think it's really interesting there that you mentioned that girls tend to perform better than boys in early education. It's very, very true. But that is not an absolute rule. And I think the same can be applied to gender in a funny sort of way.
Yeah, but Tom, gender is directly informed by biology and sex. We're not just entirely blank slates when it comes to gender.
In the same way that girls tend to have certain characteristics and the sort of curves of sexual characteristics are bimodal in that way.
How can you have a curve of sexual characteristics and then call it bimodal? I mean, don't get me wrong, there are intersex people, but there's so few of them, they're barely worth taking notice of in a debate like this. And it's actually a more interesting question, should these schools allow intersex people in? Because intersex people tend to then choose one gender or the other. And that's genuinely probably a more pressing issue than whether adolescents who think they're trans should be able to go to a school of the opposite sex.
It's the same in terms of performance. If you see what I mean, what happens when we're looking at transgender people is that actually a lot of characteristics are generally a little bit ambiguous there.
No, I don't know exactly what you mean by when we look at trans people, they have ambiguous characteristics. Because I don't think you're talking about non-binary people who aren't trans, they're non-binary. Trans implies they transitioned from one gender to the other, not went to a made-up one.
And on a case-by-case basis, as absolutely should be the case in schools and in prisons and situations like that, there are many people who would be absolutely out of whack at a boys' school, who should absolutely be going to a girls' school.
Tom, you know they can go to mixed schools where they don't have discrimination based on sexual characteristics, right? Why can't they go to those ones?
Who would be indistinguishable for you and I between other girls at that school.
Yes, but they won't be indistinguishable when girls are at their most vulnerable, say in changing rooms or toilets. And even then, it's completely up to the institutions. Even by the terrible Equalities Act 2010, they're allowed to do this. So the presenter of this segment then makes the point that if a father with daughters was sending his daughters to an all-girls school and felt very uncomfortable that there would be someone in that school who was potentially getting changed in front of them and had different genitalia, something that is obviously something a girl doesn't have, especially if it's a fee-paying school, why shouldn't they have a say in it? And this is Tom's reply to that.
But they're making a blanket restriction there. They're not treating this as an individualist situation. They're being particularly unconservative about this, if you really want to go that far.
Tom Harwood trying to gatekeep conservatism has to be the funniest thing I've heard all year. What the hell is unconservative about opposing a progressive push to completely destroy the sexual dichotomy between boys and girls? Genuinely, I can't think of anything more progressive than saying this person who was clearly born a boy, who's now at your girls' school, you have to refer to as a girl and ignore absolutely every instinct you have. Because people are hardwired to tell the difference between boys and girls and men and women. And that's why it sucks for trans people. They have to put a lot of effort in and a lot of money in to successfully present as the opposite sex.
They're rejecting a view of people as individuals and treating this as if it's a blanket group where there's absolutely no leeway at all.
Tom, there is no leeway when it comes to sex. As you said before, it's bimodal. You are either a man or a woman, or in very rare cases you are intersex, but you are still closer to one than the other. And in even rarer cases, you're not.
The situation that existed up until this week, the situation that existed beforehand when individual schools could make those individual choices, I think was a much better situation.
So Tom Harwood shifted his position from there shouldn't be a blanket ban on any school, and now he's saying, oh, well, it should be up to individual schools' choices. Well, Tom, this is an individual institution's choice that happens to collectively affect the policy of 25 all-girls schools in Britain, and they mainly seem to be based in the southeast. So your argument of this is affecting all trans rights in Britain is just ridiculous. It's 25 schools in the southeast, and honestly, I do hope it affects the whole of Britain soon, because I don't see a good reason to ignore reality.
Had much greater consent and really delivered much better outcomes than this outright ban that tries to deny people's individuality.
Doesn't deny any individuality. By this logic, Tom is saying you can identify as whatever the hell you want. I'm sorry, but by their definition, and not even their definition, by the general definition of girls, they have to be female. And again, if a boy starts to think he is transgender and wants to be a girl and doesn't feel comfortable at an all-boys school, there are mixed schools everywhere in the UK they can go to. I don't understand how this is such a big issue, Tom. So there's then a bit of an argument bringing up intersex people, which this argument isn't even about. And then it goes into the school's capacity to actually try and identify case-by-case individuals, which again, I don't really care about, since it completely sidesteps the issue. But then Calvin really does get to the core of what this argument's about, and directly asks Tom a sensible question.
Who would not?
But they're not girls, so let's break that down. So, you put out a tweet saying trans women aren't males as a follow-up to this tweet. I'd like to know how you define what a male is.
I mean, what an excellent question, because you can by definition only be a trans woman if you are male. It's at the core of the definition. You have transitioned from being a man, an adult human male, into being a trans woman, i.e. trying to pass off as a woman. And the reasons behind that doesn't matter to me. It's an excellent question to ask Tom, because he can only look like an idiot if he defends it.
I think a male is someone who is perceived by society.
Wow, imagine falling at the first hurdle. Male has nothing to do with societal perception.
As a man,
Wow, that's even worse. A man is someone who is perceived by society to be male, or to at least look like they were born male. He's completely got sex and gender the complete opposite way round, and this is what I mean. He looks like an idiot.
If I was walking down a street and I'd never met someone before, and I looked at them and I say hello, I'd likely say hello, sir, if they looked like a bloke, and I'd say hello, miss, if they look like a woman.
I don't know what the hell that had to do with the definition of male and female. Male doesn't even have anything to do with humans specifically. A male is just a creature that produces sperm. That's literally all male means, and obviously female means a creature that produces eggs, or gametes if you really want the scientific term. It has absolutely nothing to do with society.
What happens when they end up in the changing rooms and they drop their trousers?
I don't know about you, but I never took down my pants at school.
Tom, did you never do any sports? We used to have showers every Wednesday afternoon after games. Of course, boys mostly kept their boxers on as they did that, but there's no way you're getting away with going through secondary school without having to get changed in the changing room. And I went to a mixed school, and guess what? They completely separated the boys from the girls for the exact issue that has been brought up by the presenter.
But I think that a lot of people
conflating gender and sex, though.
I don't think so, because there are sexual characteristics as well as gender characteristics.
Yes, and gender characteristics are informed by your sex, because your sex is a lot more than just your genitalia. Men and women are wired differently in the brain, for example. The way men and women go through puberty is different. And don't get me wrong, men and women are more similar than they are different, and boys and girls are a lot more similar than they are different before they go through puberty. But this is secondary schools we're talking about, and if a boy thinks he's transgender, unless you put him on replacement hormones, which I really wouldn't do because that seems to cause a lot of problems, it's going to be very awkward for everyone involved.
And for example, many young people, not enough because the situation and the access to a lot of these facilities is very poor in this country. Healthcare has an incredible waiting lists, although I think it's around in the region of 500 under 18s are currently being treated.
I mean, yes, the NHS is terrible. And there are also multiple other issues with Tavistock, the one gender clinic we have in the UK for adolescents. And there's a lot of staff from there are leaving because it's basically completely unethical, some of the things they get up to there, i.e. encouraging kids to transition when they're probably not gender dysphoric, and a load of other issues I've gone into in other videos. But even if we take those 500 kids being treated for gender dysphoria, again, it's basically a non-issue. How many of these kids are actually trying to get into these all-girls schools? And this is just coming from a place of principle. I don't necessarily think these trans kids are going to cause any problems if they go to these schools. But the principle is that this institution has a policy, and the policy they chose is single sex. They define girls, as they should do, by sex. And boys' schools don't really have this problem because, honestly, the issues that come about this clearly are going to affect women more than men. Because, just to be frank, men are not going to be that threatened by women transitioning to being men. But would these kids really be out of place in a mixed school? I really don't think so. And again, this affects 25 schools. It doesn't affect every all-girls school in the country. But obviously the presenter has to get them back on topic because we need to talk about whether a school can pick and choose which students they allow into their schools.
I'm not disputing their right to take the decision. Clearly it's within their right to do that. It's within our rights to do a lot of things that we might not necessarily do if we wanted to be kind or polite or generous or open-hearted.
I love the framing of that. If you make your school single sex, you are not being kind, generous or open-hearted. No, you're being evil. It is literally how a leftist argues. They have to go straight for emotional arguments because any logical argument just doesn't work. And unfortunately, emotional arguments are actually pretty good at getting the public on side, as Tom Harwood is about to point out.
And I think that one of the interesting things in that tweet that you showed earlier, I pointed to some of the research around this. And it's just how out of step this decision is with the views of the British people as a whole.
Yes, he is, of course, referring to the polls he was bringing up before from YouGov, which shows that the country is only slightly in favour of calling trans women women. But it didn't at all ask about this specific issue, which is a completely different issue, Tom.
And as a whole,
can we pull up the tweet?
As a whole, the British people are actually very in favour of transgender rights.
That's
They're
a
likely to
disingenuous
say
read of the stats,
that trans women are women and trans men are men.
Well, the public are wrong then, aren't they, Tom? The truth doesn't really care what the public think. Trans women cannot produce eggs. Therefore, they are not women because they are not adult human females. And I'm not going to allow you to redefine that term because it has been an incredibly useful term for millennia, across multiple cultures as well.
Actually, women in general are overwhelmingly more likely than men.
Okay.
It's to say it's 52% of women who say trans women are women, whereas only 33% who say they're not.
Well, look,
Well, then it turns out women are more wrong than men. You can clip that one out if you want. There's then another argument about what the public think, and I really don't care. I want to get down to the principles and definitions.
there are very clear biological differences between men and women, between males and females. First of all, males produce sperm, females produce eggs.
Not all of them, but most.
There are many
Oh, for Christ's sake, you get the idea though, don't you, Tom? It's that whole argument of, oh, so after you go through menopause and you can't produce eggs anymore, does that mean you're not a woman anymore? It's like saying a human is no longer a human because they're missing a limb. It's a general rule of thumb, it's making the exception the rule, and it's a ridiculous thing to do. But when you've got a 15-minute segment, it really doesn't matter if you're pointing out exceptions, it just wastes time.
illnesses that only women get or that only men get predominantly. Cervical cancer, prostate cancer, as prime examples. There are many differences. May not tend to be physically more powerful.
But these are tendencies. These are tendencies.
Every rule.
Yes, they do tend to be tendencies, but this means that... But then if we're going by this definition, does that mean all weak men should be defined as girls? No, we are obviously looking at modal averages.
It's a tendency, it's a majority. There are always exceptions to the rule.
Right, exactly.
But
And
the
we're
point-
talking,
no,
and I think the point here,
Calvin make his-
I think the point, hang
But the
on,
point
hang on.
is, if we take away, if what we're doing here is we're raising women, we're saying that women don't exist, you choose to be a woman or not.
Calvin's absolutely right here. All that Tom Harwood has said is that if you are male, it's entirely defined by yourself because you will tell society what you think you are. It's atomised individualism on steroids.
And what we do there is we erase the argument that women are fought for.
I think it's
because
dangerous to say it's a choice.
No, because you're basing sex on something else. You're arguing about gender. I'm talking about sex in that it's about reproduction. And this is why people have shaped, over the centuries, or men have shaped laws in order to control women's liberties through their reproduction.
I don't know why the hell Calvin's all of a sudden bringing this up. Unfortunately, this is about how right-wing you can get as a young person and still get onto mainstream TV. We are literally having a TERF and a trans radical activist arguing on the most right-wing news source in the UK. Also, he says men created laws to control women's reproduction. I mean, women supported it as well. It wasn't like women got the vote and all of a sudden we have a sexual revolution. No, that had to happen throughout the 60s, 50 years after they got the vote, or 40 years.
When we talk about sex-selective abortion, when we talk about FGM, when we talk about all these battles that women have fought so hard for years and centuries.
Hang on, sex-selective abortion and FGM? These were not laws or issues in Britain. I'm not being funny. I'm just saying it seems to be a very 21st century issue in Britain for certain areas, the FGM. And the sex-selective abortion? I don't think that's ever been an issue in Britain.
To kind of get some say in their own individuality. And you're a person who fights for individuality, so
Absolutely.
It's surprising to me that you're fighting against women being women.
He tried to pull out a hypocrite argument to Tom Harwood and it just fell flat. I do think it is actually a good idea to try and use their own principles against them to try and make them out to be a hypocrite. I don't think it's the worst strategy in the world, but I don't think it's going to work on someone who doesn't have principles like Tom Harwood. Well, so anyway, next we seem to go a bit off topic from the issue at hand, but the presenter does bring up a good point, because everything Calvin just said was a bit irrelevant, and I think it's worth showing bad arguments against these types of arguments that Tom Harwood comes up with. But we then get onto the issue of not everyone who is trans is gender dysphoric. He brings up the fact that some trans women will try and do their best to get into a woman's prison, causing more issues, and that failing sports people may try and get a bit of stolen valour, if you will, by saying that they're trans women and then getting into women's competitions at, say, weightlifting. And so he directly asked Tom Harwood what his response to that is.
I think that there are 2 points with regard to this. This is why, number one, it should be taken on a case-by-case basis. There are some really evident cases where in prisons some trans women should not be in women's prisons. There are some really evident cases, actually, where some trans women would be torn limb from limb in men's prisons and should absolutely be in women's prisons.
I'll be honest, I've not heard of any case of that second part being true, but I'm not going to lie, there are probably cases where that's true, though I'd need to see cited examples. And, you know, the problem with doing this by case-by-case basis thing is that, well, that can easily just make a load of pointless admin work that fills up time, costs taxpayer money for something that really should just be a simple solution of base these things on the sex on your birth certificate, as the schools have done. It just avoids majority of these problems, and as I say, I'd really need to look into the trans women who should be in women's prisons because they'd be torn limb from limb in males' prisons. I don't know what he's referring to there. Though let's just say people that end up on sexual offenders registers don't tend to fare well in prisons.
And obviously, this is a case-by-case individualist basis on which we should take these decisions. As Calvin was rightly saying earlier, predominantly some diseases affect men, some affect women, predominantly blah, blah, blah.
It's not predominant. You literally can't get cervical cancer if you don't have a cervix, i.e. you are a man. But again, that's completely sidestepping the issue, but I do find it interesting that you have to use this language. It's like if you use the term all to describe any group, no matter how true it is, you're somehow going against liberal principles, which just isn't the case at all.
And there are these edge cases, and this is all we're talking about. The number of trans children in this country is so very small. 12 million children, maybe 2,000 of them trans. And that is the point. Edge case is very small. We shouldn't be doing broad brushstrokes.
See, it's things like this that make me laugh. He's just admitted that this is a tiny problem. So he's basically just admitted that he's completely virtue signalling. This is basically a non-issue. And the number went up, by the way. He said 500 kids being treated for transgenderism or whatever it is before. It's now risen to 2,000. And he'll probably inflate it next time as well. So there you go, complete non-issue, basically affects no one. Let's spurg out on Twitter about it. Nice one, Tom. But anyway, that's the last of that GB News segment I wanted to go through, and just show you that Tom Harwood would rather feel good about himself than give a toss about scientific truth or any sort of truth. But there is one more clip I want to go through, and this comes from a tweet that Tom Harwood himself thought was a very good video to put up on Twitter. So he said, "You jolly well know that I'm female just by looking at me and talking to me. There we have it, admission that you shouldn't score someone's chromosomes to know how to refer to them." But this is the clip that came with it, and all I can sum it up as is Tom Harwood posting his L's.
I can only assume that you don't have any trans friends, that you've never met anyone who is trans.
Well, I might assume you don't know any women.
I mean, again, Tom Harwood just using the bigot comment. This is the last thing anyone hired by GB News should be doing. Come on, just fire him. He's more at home in The Guardian.
If you were to walk past someone in the street who was trans, how on earth would you be able to tell? You would, of course,
do you honestly think that most women don't recognise men? Do you honestly think the human race has got this far without recognising biological sex? We do it in a matter of seconds.
What do you mean by
I mean, she is completely right. We are hardwired to notice the difference. I mean, no offence to any trans people who happen to watch this, but unless you have gone through a vast amount of expensive surgery, people are going to notice. And it genuinely, it can't be helped. Our brains are wired to notice the difference, because we actually get a lot of information from a first glance at a person. It's just evolutionary biology. There's nothing we can do about it, and Tom's obviously the whole time just trying to deny that. It's just completely stupid blank slateism.
Biological sex. I don't check you for your chromosomes. I look at you and see you as a woman.
You fully well
if I
know
were to
that
see
I'm a
someone
female
walking
just
down
by
the
looking
street
at
who
me and
had
talking to me.
secondary
How
sex
ridiculous.
characteristics of a female, I would say they were female.
Yeah, Tom is just completely denying that any sort of biology infers gender. And that's why I'm with this woman who's just laughing at him. Tom's pinnacle principle for some reason is atomised individualism, which no one sensible would ever go for. Humans are social creatures, and we tend to even get incredibly depressed when we are lonely, so you have to have constant negotiations with society, and Harwood's argument is that basically society shouldn't have any say on how individuals behave or how they are defined, despite the fact that society pretty much entirely is defining both. So trying to deny that, especially with something that is so obviously based in biology, such as sex and gender, and trying to deny that we identify that through hardwired subconscious identifiers in our brain is just ridiculous. You can't force people to be blank slates, and you certainly can't force people to see anyone else as a blank slate. I mean, for God's sake, we see differences in gender as soon as babies are born. Obviously, there's the famous test that newborns, as soon as they come out of the womb, they're shown a picture of a crane and a picture of a person. Girls tend to look more at the person, boys tend to look more at the crane. And that's even the same in the animal kingdom. So to say I don't check your chromosomes, so can't for certain say that if you are a man or a woman, just a ridiculous statement. Of course you can. John Locke was completely wrong 400 years ago when he put forward his theory of blank slatism. And what's even more embarrassing is that we've had 400 years of people refuting that, and people like Tom Harwood still try and push it. But anyway, I don't want this video to go on for half an hour, so I will leave it there. Hopefully YouTube doesn't give me a community strike, but who knows these days. Anyway, if you made it this far in the video, I may as well announce that the Wellington Project have a snazzy new updated website. Links are down below in the description, and of course, as usual, if you want to write an article for us, all you have to do is send us an email of the article to contact@wellingtonproject.co.uk, and we will look into it getting published. Topics can range from economics to science to culture to history. You can write about whatever you want as long as it follows our mission statement, which of course can be found on the website. But anyway, before I reach half an hour, I will say that's everything I had for you today. So, as usual, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.